It's Monday here on the Northshore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm Chris Carter with Ray Fittipaldo. We're going to talk about, now that the week of the NFL draft is here, why the Steelers should be focusing on foundational pieces over trying to make the big swings happen just to complete the roster, even when the picks might not be there. We'll talk about that historical context and bring it all around so that you understand and are ready what the Steelers have to do in this week of the NFL draft. All here on the North Shore Drive podcast. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. Hello and welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm Chris Carter. He's Ray Fittipaldo, and we are your Steelers writers here. As always, you can subscribe to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette at post-gazette.com. You can find this show every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of those Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes, as well as the daily content that comes from all of our sports writers here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And as always, this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates. Whether you've been injured in an accident or you need help in representing your workers' compensation rights, Edgar Snyder Associates is here to help you. Call them today, 1-800-94-EDGAR. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. Ray, we will talk more about the prospects specifically as we get closer to the draft again, because we have gone through every position group: corner, tackle, defensive tackle, offensive line, quarterback, receiver. We've gone over safety, all the different prospects that are available. But I want to use this episode to provide some historical context at the start of the week, because I brought this up on Channel 11's WPXI's Final Word show on Sunday night. And I think the thing that people need to remember is that the Steelers need to be building with foundational pieces moving forward. They need to be finding a way to pick the players in this draft class that are the actual best player available and are still important to the overall scheme of what they want to be, an identity of what they want to be. And that's relevant when it comes to the quarterback position versus other positions, because you and we have been banging the table. The Steelers should take one of these top tier defensive tackles. They're highly graded. It's a need. They need to get better at stuffing the run. This would go a long way to getting there. But there's some out there in the national media. There's some people out there that say the Steelers just need to swing at quarterback, whether that's Jaxson Dart or Jalen Milroe or whoever it is. They need to just take a shot because they don't have a quarterback. And I think a big example that I look back to, granted a little different here because it ended up this quarterback ended up being really good. But if you go back to 2001 when the Steelers were building that core that lasted throughout the into the 2010s, they made a big draft pick with it. Was one of Kevin Colbert's first picks, and in Bill Cowher's pick there in 2001, they picked Casey Hampton in the first round. Now, many people don't remember, but they passed on picking Drew Brees with that pick, and they got one of the best nose tackles in football, a guy that was a foundational piece for what made the Steelers defense. And yes, Drew Brees became a Hall of Fame quarterback, and that would be interesting. But I don't know if Drew Brees comes to Pittsburgh at that stage, does he lead them to Super Bowl wins the way that Ben Roethlisberger did once that foundation was established and ready for the starting quarterback? And that's where I think the Steelers are today as far as trying to get back to being that contender.
Yeah, so two things about that. I think people forget, Chris, Drew Brees was drafted by the Chargers.
Yep.
Didn't play a whole heck of a lot early in his career. And you just wonder, not just if Bill Cowher drafted him, but listen, if Sean Payton wasn't the guy to develop him in New Orleans, and I'm not saying Drew Brees was simply a systems quarterback. I'm not saying that.
No.
But that system was perfect for him. They had the team around him where they were, a contender in short order. They won a Super Bowl. So that you have to digest that part of it and realize that your landing place has to be right as well. Like the match between the quarterback and the coaches has to be good. And number two, when we're on the subject, honestly, for the Steelers, can you go down that road of drafting a guy like Shedeur Sanders or Jaxson Dart only 3 years after you did the whole Kenny Pickett thing?
Yeah.
Because they were convinced 3 years ago, Chris, that Kenny Pickett could be a franchise quarterback. And, looking back, we all know how that turned out. So they might have a first-round grade on Jaxson Dart, as our own Jerry Dulac reported. That's all fine and good. But on draft night, if their defensive line targets are gone, can they pull the trigger on that, knowing that they're only 3 years removed from what happened with Kenny Pickett? That's going to be the decision. From my perspective, I hope they get a defensive lineman, but it would be a great exercise for me to say, okay, the 3D linemen are gone. Would they take a quarterback or would they go someplace else? I think that would tell us that would really tell us, where they are post Pickett and how they feel about their evaluation of quarterbacks.
Yeah, I think it would say a lot. And again, like, look, part of this is you need to trust what you're doing as an evaluator, right? Like, us as evaluators, like we're not in the scout room. We don't have the advantages that these guys have. They can travel all across the country. They can watch all sorts of tapes that we don't have access to. They know secrets about these players that we will never know. But through that evaluation process, do they think that one of those guys is the guy? And if it is, okay, take that shot. But the whole point of this process is, Ray, is to make sure that you're actually going and getting the best player that's available for them right now. And sometimes the importance of the quarterback position that outweighs a talent gap if it's marginal. If you have a legit first round quarterback that you have a legitimate first round grade on, and hey, maybe they see Jaxson Dart that way, but you know what, there was the thought that they saw Mason Rudolph as a first round graded quarterback, but they were happy to take him in the third. I think that's where the Steelers have to kind of look at is the difference in talent not as dire between those D tackles and the quarterbacks like Jaxson Dart and Jalen Milroe. If they think so, then by all means they should move on that. But my opinion, there is a big gap there, and you have a chance right now to take a good, legitimate swing on a foundational piece to an important part of your identity. And again, it's not like they're picking a kicker in the first round. It's not like they're taking a tight end in the first round. They're taking a defensive tackle, which is essential to the identity that they have been and want to continue to be in being a physical defensive front. Again, this organization is priding itself on trying to build the way that Howie Roseman has built the Eagles, which is why they brought Andy Weidl in. And what did Andy Weidl and Howie Roseman done? He has continued to build the trenches, and he has continued to invest at D tackle. And they have a defensive front and an offensive front that dominate those lines of scrimmages and have made them Super Bowl champions. If the Steelers are to follow that, they need to actually follow that and not take random swings at players that most likely aren't going to help you in the long run.
Yeah, listen, roster building takes on all kinds of different ebbs and flows over the years. Chris, the 05 and 08 Super Bowl teams were built around the defense. A young, up-and-coming quarterback, an offense that did just what you needed, made some big plays here and there, and, they were able to win 2 Super Bowls. 5 years later, let's say post-2010, those 2014, 15, 16 teams, those teams were built around the offense just because that's the way they drafted and that's how that team developed. So eventually, what you got to do if you're the Steelers, if you're looking to continue being this team that's going to be strong defensively, you're going to have to start replacing guys like Cam Hayward and other guys, Minkah Fitzpatrick. You have to pull the Band-Aid off. And you can't just say, okay, Cam Hayward made the All-Pro team at 35. He's going to do it again at 36. He might, but it doesn't always work out that way. So, the Steelers are kind of at the tipping point right now, the way I see it. They're still a team that's built around the defense. They've put a lot of their resources into the offense the last couple of years. Eventually, that's going to change, but you have to have a good all-around team. And I just think it's time that they address this defense in the draft. It's been a while since they do that, and I think they have to do that if they want to continue to have like a top 10, top 12 defense like they've had the last couple of years.
I hear you there. I want to talk about an article that you wrote and that looked at the gap that that I think where a lot of the anxiety around the quarterback position is the gap that existed between the success of Terry Bradshaw and the success of Ben Roethlisberger and what led to that and where they are now since Ben Roethlisberger as far as how they've tried to address the quarterback situation. We'll talk about that next here on the Northshore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, I want to remind you this show is brought to you by Edgar Snyder Associates, who also do workers' compensation rights. If you've been hurt on the job, you need to know who decides when you're better and who decides when your treatment is over and who decides when your benefits are over. The answer might surprise you. It's actually the insurance company's doctors. If you feel like they're not going to be on your side, they probably won't be. And that's why you need someone on your side. And that's the person to have on your side. It's Edgar Snyder Associates. Call their law offices today at 1-800-94-EDGAR because they'll fight for your workers' compensation right that you deserve every single day. And remember, there's never a fee unless they get money for you. We're back here on the North Shore Drive podcast on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, let's talk about the piece that you wrote for this weekend. It was looking at, the quarterback situation and how things have played out. What is the biggest thing that you feel like leads to these quarterback gaps? Is it not taking enough swings? Because I think there's a philosophy out there that says, when you don't have a quarterback, you need to take every swing possible until you find that quarterback. But when you do that, and you miss a lot if you're just taking random wild swings. You're missing on opportunities to build the roster to be ready for that quarterback. Yeah. What did your research lead you to finding and going over all the options?
The biggest takeaway for me was I think I rattled off 14 starting quarterbacks from Terry Bradshaw's retirement until the day Ben Roethlisberger was drafted. Okay, that was a 20-year span. Right now, we're only 4 years post Ben Roethlisberger, and we're already, if Aaron Rodgers comes here, we are already at 6 quarterbacks. So that tells me the evaluation of their guys, the Mitch Trubisky evaluation. We just got done talking about it. The Kenny Pickett evaluation, right? Bringing in an older guy like Russell Wilson. All those things were tried, and they failed ultimately. And you look back on Chuck Noll's final years and then the early years of Ben Roethlisberger, you actually had some stopgaps where they were successful. Bobby Brister won a playoff game in Houston, almost in the divisional round, almost beat the top seed Denver Broncos the following week. Then you went to Neil O'Donnell. Neil O'Donnell, by no means, he was never a Pro Bowl quarterback. You were probably never going to win a Super Bowl with him, but they had such a good defense that they got to a Super Bowl with him. And then after O'Donnell, you had Cordell Stewart. And, we know what happened there. He was good enough to get them to a certain point, but obviously they knew they eventually had to get their franchise guy. So for me, the biggest difference is we're almost halfway there with the number in the Steelers had. And, they just haven't been able to win in the playoffs with the likes of Kenny Pickett or Russell Wilson. And thinking about that, I give Chuck Noll all the credit in the world for getting to an AFC championship game with Mark Malone. Yeah. I give him all the credit in the world for doing the same thing with Bubby Brister. And I do the same thing with Bill Cowher, what he did with Neil O'Donnell and Cordell Stewart. Now, they didn't win a Super Bowl in that span, but they got there. And that's a big shortcoming, I think, of Mike Tomlin. Since Ben Roethlisberger retired, you have a good roster, find a way to win in the postseason. That's my biggest takeaway.
And I think that's part of it, right? I think that's part of the fan frustration is that they haven't seen that postseason success, even at the tail end of Roethlisberger's career. And I think that's the biggest mark on Mike Tomlin. But I also wonder how much of it is the day and age that we're in now, where quarterback is just that much important, and it's the quarterbacks that they've been going up against. I mean, their last several playoff losses. Lamar Jackson, a guy that was up for MVP this past year. The year before that, Josh Allen, the guy who won MVP this year. The 2 years before that, when they were in the playoffs, it was Patrick Mahomes. I mean, literally the 3 big dogs of the AFC, and that's not even counting Joe Burrow in that equation. And it's different than going up against like Stan Humphries and guys like that Bill Cowher would lose to in the AFC Championship game. And listen, like Bill Cowher had some heck of a wins. He beat Peyton Manning with Ben Roethlisberger in his second year, and like that was certainly impressive then. But I think that's the thing that is has people wondering is, can the Steelers get to that point where they are just that good that they can hang in there with mid to bad quarterback play, and still have that roster that goes up against those superstars at quarterbacks. That we've seen them do it in the regular season. We've seen them beat Joe Burrow plenty of times. We've seen them beat Josh Allen. We haven't seen them beat Patrick Mahomes, but we've seen them beat Lamar Jackson several times. They've done that. But the question, I think, will be, can they keep building to be a team that can at least hang in there until they find that next quarterback? Because Ray, again, when we look at what it was, back in 2000, I go harkening back to the topic that I led off with in 2001 when that draft was happening, there was no Cordell Stewart was not a surefire thing. He was there was a lot of speculation he was getting benched for Kent Graham the year before. So. Right. Them being comfortable enough at quarterback to still pick foundational pieces, I think helped set the stage so that Ben Roethlisberger, when he came in, he said like there was a leadership structure in place. He didn't have to do a whole lot when it came to that. He could just play football and just be focused on that. That's where I think the Steelers are right now. They need, and that's why they need to keep investing in doing that, so that when the guy that they really think is the guy is there, you can go take a swing. But if you take random swings, and I think that's part of it is in today's NFL, with free agency and all the other things that are much more active and the bigger salary cap numbers, there's a lot more movement that's going to happen at quarterback, and it's managing it. That's a very tricky thing.
Yeah. Two things on that. I agree with you in one respect, but I'll push back on you in another respect. I think really good coaches find ways to win in the playoffs. If you look back at 84, Mark Malone beat John Elway. Okay. John Elway. I know the Broncos weren't the Broncos yet of the late 90s, but they beat John Elway in 1984 on the road. They beat Warren Moon in 1984 on the road. Same thing, like the Oilers were like a juggernaut, right? Regular season juggernaut. They could never figure it out in the playoffs. With the Steelers, they pulled some upsets there. Those were two good wins in the final years of Chuck Noll, even though if you look at that, that span from like 81 to 91, his final 10 years or so, you didn't get another Super Bowl, but they did rise up and provide some moments for their fans in that span. But you are right in one respect. Even though the Eagles won this last Super Bowl, I think the AFC is a stronger conference now. And if you go back to the 80s, in that time, the 80s, the AFC was the weaker conference. I think from 81, after the Raiders won in 1980, from 81, I think through 90 or 92, didn't we have like 9 or 10 consecutive NFC
something like that
Super Bowl champions? I mean, you had the 49ers, you had the Redskins, Cowboys. You had the Cowboys, you had the Giants. I mean, that was the era of the NFC. So you are right in that regard. This AFC, the Steelers are going up against now, it's much tougher to beat a quarterback like a Joe Burrow or a Josh Allen or anybody else that they're going to meet in the playoffs.
Yeah, and also I think it would have been timing. When they beat John Elway, he was like an 18 touchdown, 15 interception second-year quarterback that was still on his way to becoming the John Elway that we know now. He was more of the young hot shot back then. Right. I do wonder what they would have been like if they had faced off like against like second-year Josh Allen in the playoffs. That would have been a different story than like because Bill Cowher faced John Elway in the playoffs when he was Mr. John Elway, and he got smacked around by him. So like I think that there's I think that again, it's always interesting to compare eras too, because like quarterbacks in the 80s and the 90s, even in the 2000s, were different than what they're able to do now, just because of how the rules have changed, how the game has developed, how the schemes and things developed. And that's where I do think it's on Mike Tomlin to figure out, hey, like if you're the defensive guy, you need to be adjusting to your time so that you can keep this team competing with those top tier quarterbacks, even when you don't have that quarterback play. And I think the Eagles are an interesting case where Jalen Hurts is obviously not in that top tier quarterback, but he's good enough to get them there. And I think the Steelers are looking for at least that good enough quarterback that gets them there. But of course, it'd be wonderful if they could get a superstar themselves and actually do a good job evaluating quarterbacks. And Ray, that might be the ultimate point here. Is the question is, can Omar Khan, can Mike Tomlin, can Andy Weidl, can their quarterback evaluation process yield a positive result? Because so far they have had nothing that is stuck.
Yeah, and to be fair, Kenny Pickett was Kevin Colbert's final
Very
pick.
true.
So we should point that out. Omar and Andy's first draft was 2023. So if they do draft a quarterback this year, it'll be their first crack at it. And I think we have to keep that in perspective.
Absolutely. We got to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk about something else that you were bringing up, and how Kevin Colbert built a lot of the success with the successful picks like Casey Hampton versus the struggles that he had late that have set the Steelers up for where they are now in trying to fill a lot of the holes that have been left there. We'll talk about that next here on the Northshore Drive podcast and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. But first, we'll remind you the show is also brought to you by UFC Gym. April is Stress Awareness Month, and studies show that doing even one group exercise class a week can significantly reduce stress. So there's no better time to move your body and reset your mind than at UFC Gym. However you want to blow off steam, they've got it. They've got boxing, kickboxing, Zumba, MMA, HIIT, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, muscle makeover, spin, yoga, cardio core, bar, youth classes, and silver sneakers. Ready to feel stronger inside and out? Drop in this week at UFC Gym, Market Square, or the Waterfront to try a class for free at UFC Gym Pittsburgh. We're back here in the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo. Ray, there's been a lot of talk about how the Steelers haven't hit on a lot of first-round picks of late. Now, granted, it's tough to really put anything on Omar Khan's first two picks, Broderick Jones and Troy Fautanu. Jones is entering his third year and was seen as a raw prospect who was going to take time to develop. Fautanu didn't play last year because he was injured. But if you do look at Kevin Colbert's end of his career, you have from 2017 until now, the only first-round pick that he made that is still on the roster is T.J. Watt. 2018 was Terrell Edmonds. 2019 was Devin Bush, and they traded up for him. You throw in 2016 as well and say Artie Burns, didn't work out. 2020 they traded away for Minka Fitzpatrick, which I'd say the trade worked because he certainly brought in an all-star talent there. 2021 Najee Harris has now been let go. 2022 they traded away Kenny Pickett. So that's a large gap of first-round talent that is not on this team. And I think it's another sign of it's kind of remarkable that the bottom hasn't come out on this team with those misses here. But when you look at that versus what Kevin Colbert did early, he drafted Casey Hampton, Troy Polamalu, Ben Roethlisberger. He put down, he built that foundation that we've been talking about throughout this episode that the Steelers need to build now, and just didn't do those same things later. When you look at the difference between how they went through those draft processes and try to, I guess, compute that into what lessons you can learn from that today, what are the things that you pull out of that?
Yeah, I mean, just take the best player available. We've been doing these videos for our YouTube page, and I pointed out, I was talking about the tight ends in this class, and people don't remember how they got Heath Miller. I think Heath Miller had a sports hernia injury that prevented him from working out when he was at Virginia in 2005, and he fell all the way to the Steelers at the end of the first round. He was the second to last pick of the first round. So they're looking around, okay, we got best player available. We got Heath Miller. Let's take him. And that came in the years consecutively. I mean, how great was this, Chris? Polamalu in 03.
Yep.
Roethlisberger in 04. Heath Miller in 05. Santonio Holmes in 2006. Now, Santonio Holmes had issues here. He didn't sign a second contract, but they don't win Super Bowl 43 without Santonio Holmes, right?
Exactly.
So those four picks were money. Like, even if you want to pick out one quote-unquote bad pick for Kevin Colbert in the first half of his tenure, let's say Ziggy Hood, didn't sign a second contract. Chris, Ziggy Hood was good enough to start in Super Bowl 45 for the Steelers. He was a starting caliber player for them. Now, they over-recruited. They went out and got Cam Hayward in 11. They didn't feel like Ziggy was good enough to sign a second contract. That's fine, but that guy was still a starter for you in a Super Bowl. And all those guys you rattled off, Artie Burns, Terrell Edmonds, Devin Bush, none of those guys, I don't care where they're playing with the Steelers or anybody else, they're not good enough to be a starter on any Super Bowl type of team or even
Right.
a playoff caliber team. That's the difference between the first half of Kevin's tenure and the second half. They just whiffed on way too many first and second round picks.
And I think part of it too, again, you went away from best player available. You know, you look at those draft classes in 2016 when they went for cornerback, when they were when they picked Artie Burns. That was a big need. That was such a huge need. I mean, I remember that time as far as, you know, people thinking like, hey, like you're coming off the 2015 season, right? And what was the big thing? They were just getting roasted at cornerbacks. They just needed an outside cornerback presence. So if they could just find that guy, maybe they'll be able to figure things out. Well, they tried that guy at Artie Burns. Was a complete whiff there. Who are some of the players that they missed on? Well, maybe they could have had Kenny Clark, who became a pretty good defensive tackle for the Green Bay Packers. You know, maybe they could have had Emmanuel Ogbah, who was an edge rusher. You know, with Jalen Smith, Miles Jack in his prime. You know, when he was coming out of college and was more, or if they had gone, or Chris Jones. I mean, imagine Chris Jones picked maybe 10 picks, not 10 picks after Artie Burns. Like, again, and again, it's tough to go draft to draft and just say, oh yeah, well, obviously Chris Jones was so much better, even though he was in the second round. He was a second round pick there. But I think that a lot of us agree when you look at Artie Burns. And again, you know, Terrell Edmonds, safety was such a huge need. They were getting torched at the safety position. So I get wanting to go get a safety there, but getting a guy like Terrell Edmonds that I think across the board, a lot of people had third round grades on him versus Lamar Jackson, first round grade sitting right there and going 4 picks later. You know, imagine if those two things alone are flipped, where they go, just, hey, you know what? Let's just take this guy, either Kenny Clark or Chris Jones, because Chris Jones is obviously a better player. Kenny Clark was just picked earlier at D tackle. They go with that instead of Burns, and they go with Lamar Jackson instead of Terrell Edmonds. And again, hindsight's always 20/20 and all that, but it changes everything by not swinging at positions for need and swinging at positions for best player available. That's why we are saying right now, the Steelers, and again, pulling this back to what you can learn about this now and how you can apply this moving forward, the Steelers cannot afford to go back into, well, we need a quarterback, so we're just going to take a quarterback no matter what. You have to evaluate this class honestly, rank them on your big board honestly, and then say, okay, if we really think that Shedeur Sanders is better than Kenneth Grant, okay, that's your evaluation. But if you're looking at this and you legitimately say, you know what, Shedeur Sanders, Jaxson Dart, we'll say their first round grades, but they're more like, we see them as we wouldn't want to take them over these guys. You got to stick to that, and that might hurt a little bit initially, optics wise, because the quarterback's such a big need, but not taking those swings and missing on things that you feel are going to be bad moves because of how you rank things. And I think that is a key part of how the Steelers get back to being a team that has a better foundation.
Yeah, listen, 2 points on that. 2016 defensive line was a need for them, but they did have Cam Hayward and Stephon too. And if you remember, they took a very good player, Javon Hargrave, in the third round. So that was that situation. Hey, listen, I'm with you. Chris Jones, they probably should have picked him, make it work, work him in there with Tuitt. But
can you imagine a D-line of Chris Jones, Cam Hayward, and Stephon Tuitt? That would just be murder. That would not be fair. Like, just quit. And you know what? That defense might have been one of the greatest defenses of all time.
And who could have predicted what happened with Stephon Tuitt, right?
Exactly. You
just cannot predict that. And my second point was the quarterback situation. It's interesting. You're always afraid when you have, and Ben Roethlisberger had a great 2018 season. That wasn't a great team because I think the defense was kind of leaky, especially in the second half of that defense. But if you go back and look at Ben's stats in 2017 and 18, he's still a really good quarterback. That was before the elbow injury. But that's a lesson. When you have an aging quarterback, even if it does tick him off a little bit, maybe it's smart to draft his replacement when he's 34, 35 years old instead of trying to do it when he's 38, 39 years old or already retired. If there's one criticism, I think, of Kevin Colbert and Mike Tomlin late in Ben's career, that they didn't want to really tick him off and get him mad. But now we see what's happening, right? You try to replace him after he retires, and it's just way too difficult.
It's funny you say that. Our guy Dave Damashek, who did many years with the NFL Network, still does his show, the Minus One podcast. He's a great guy. He always does his what if NFL and the what if FL, and like it's like, you know, changing courses of history if you do certain things. And the one I always tell him is like, I still think if the Steelers take Lamar Jackson, even if Lamar Jackson does not become the 3-time MVP or 2-time MVP that he is in the NFL today, and he's just on your roster, he does not come in and save the Ravens franchise in 2018 when it was all but public. It was all but confirmed that John Harbaugh was on the way out because the ownership was done. He was done. Joe Flacco was finished. Lamar Jackson saved John Harbaugh's career and kept that this Ravens franchise alive for that time. And that was the only reason those 2018 Steelers that still had Brown, that still had Ben, that still had Pouncey and DeCastro, a young TJ. That was the only reason the Steelers didn't make the playoffs years, because the Ravens won that division. And if they're not there to win it, the Steelers make the playoffs. And who knows with that 2018 offense if they would be able to do some damage, because that was the year they beat the Patriots. In that season. And then you look at 2019 when Ben Roethlisberger's elbow does go. Again, not saying Lamar Jackson would have had the MVP season for the Steelers that he had with the Ravens, but I think it would have been a heck of a lot better than Mason Rudolph and Devlin Hodges. And so, and then in 2020, you pass on Jalen Hurts for Chase Claypool. Where does that fall into things here? I think I've often said that the Steelers trying to appease Ben Roethlisberger and not drafting quarterbacks before it was actually his time has put them in this predicament.
It's way too simple to look at it this way, but I think there's a point in here. The Ravens were able to embrace an uncomfortable period with Joe Flacco and Lamar Jackson. The Steelers weren't willing to do that. And then look at the two franchises since then, right? I mean, the Steelers are still a playoff team, but the Ravens keep knocking on the door. They haven't won that Super Bowl yet, but they are there every single year. They are a legit Super Bowl contender every single year because of Lamar Jackson.
Yeah, it also is a reminder that they got to win a conference championship game one of these days. Otherwise, it's going to be like the biggest flops ever for not having it. And I think that there's some Steelers fans out there that are like, Lamar Jackson still can't win those games, so I still wouldn't care. But to your point, I don't think anyone mistakes the Steelers for being in a better position than the Ravens for a Super Bowl run in the coming years. And a big part of that's how they handle the quarterback situation. And again, it's not taking random swings at bad quarterbacks, or quarterbacks that you think are mid tiers. It's waiting for the right times to get the quarterbacks. And if you truly evaluate them to be first round talents, go get them. And who knows? Maybe the Steelers have them. We'll have Jaxson Dart and guys like that in that position. We'll continue to keep you up to date with how the things look here. Omar Khan and Mike Tomlin, I believe, are scheduled to talk Tuesday at the Steelers facility. We'll have our team of reporters there. We'll have feedback on that on our written work. We'll also be talking that most likely on our Wednesday episode to get you ready for the Thursday start of the NFL draft. He's Ray Fittipaldo. I'm Chris Carter. Thanks so much for tuning into another episode of the Northshore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter, Ray Fittipaldo here. You can always find this show every Monday, Wednesday, Friday on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of those Monday, Wednesday, Friday episodes, as well as the daily content that comes out from all of our sports writers. Back here Wednesday, here with more on the Steelers on the North Shore Drive podcast. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.